It's Monday, June 23rd, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. It was a practically unbelievable weekend this past weekend. The U.S. bombing 3 of Iran's nuclear sites, officially bringing us into Israel's war against Iran. And we'll talk about why the administration doesn't actually think that's the case, how the bombing raid was carried out, and most importantly, what we know about what is likely to happen next. Because as I'm recording, the news broke that Iran attacked a U.S. airbase in Qatar, our largest military base in the Middle East. But before we get to all of that, make sure that you're following and subscribe to Make It Make Sense with Granthermes on whatever podcast app you're listening to it on. Like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, and sign up for the Make It Make Substack, where I've got a bunch of great new content up there every single week. And as always, share the show on social media. If you like what you hear here, it is Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. You can tag me in that too. I'm at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes.TV on everything else. All right, let's get to today's episode. On Saturday night, President Donald Trump announced on social media that the U.S. bombed 3 of Iran's most important nuclear enrichment facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. So, first of all, he wrote, a full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordo. All planes are safely on their way home. Congratulations to our great American warriors. And then said, there is not another military in the world that could have done this. Now is the time for peace, which he wrote in all caps. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Which, first, Trump always ends these kinds of posts with thank you, or thank you for your attention to this matter, like it's an announcement over a PA system telling someone they left their lights on in the parking lot. It's just so weird. Second, it also makes it come off like it's not this big deal and could have been missed, which, no, man, you bombed Iran. This definitely isn't going to get overlooked. But anyway, that was followed immediately afterwards by a repost of a sketchy anonymous account that claims to be an intelligence account saying that Fordo was gone. And before I get to what Trump actually said there, it has to be said that it is incredibly insane to have the President of the United States announcing a bombing campaign and our entry into another war in the Middle East over social media, and then sharing a completely unverified amount of information from an anonymous online account. Because those posts are official communications. They are diplomacy and declarations, and to have them be posted in less than 250 characters instead of announcing them in a formal address is wild. So, in that post, let's talk about what he said. Trump said the bombers dropped a full payload of bombs, which we found out later was 14 30,000-pound what are called bunker buster bombs that were dropped from B-2 stealth bombers over Fordo. The first time that those bombs or bombs like those have ever been used. Another 30 missiles were then fired from U.S. submarines at the other 2 sites. And the really odd thing is that Trump said, now is the time for peace. Although, and I'll get into this in a minute, Iran didn't start the fighting with Israel in this current fight. Now, Trump did give a very short speech from the East Wing of the White House, which is where important, but generally good news is shared by presidents. If it was something more serious or it was still ongoing, that would have been in the Oval Office. It's just how these things are done. Now, his speech said essentially the same thing that is posted, and it was less than 10 minutes long, which is odd for Trump, who usually doesn't keep things short, especially when he's taking a victory lap. But we did get a more detailed description of what happened the next morning on Sunday from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, the Chiefs of Staff are the head of the military branches that report directly to the president. And this is where we learned about those massive bombs that were used on Fordo. And I don't want to turn the description of this mission into entertainment here, so I'm going to leave a lot of the details to the bare minimum of what you need to know. And that's first, Fordo. If you didn't hear last week's episode on Thursday, Fordo is Iran's most important and most secretive nuclear site where they enrich uranium that can be used for nuclear energy or weapons. It's buried in the side of a mountain and it's deep underground. The reason that so many of those bunker buster bombs were dropped was because it's so deep in the ground. And while Trump did put out that post that said Fordo was gone, Hegseth said yesterday that he couldn't say, and officials today still cannot say, whether or not it was actually destroyed or, frankly, even all that damaged, because there's more reporting out that says Iran likely moved the majority of its enriched uranium to a secret location before the bombings, with satellite images showing a large number of trucks going in and out of Fordo in the hours before the attack. And we also learned that as part of this operation, there was another set of B-2 bombers that had been ordered to fly over the Pacific towards Iran. And we learned today that that was done because the Pentagon had been getting nervous about Trump posting things on social media during the week while Israel was launching its airstrikes against Iran and leading up to what happened in our attack and our bombing raid in Iran. So essentially, the Pentagon felt compelled to fly a very expensive fleet of B-2 bombers as a decoy because they weren't sure if Trump was tipping off Iran to something big coming on purpose or by accident. And it's important to say here that the White House is saying multiple things about this bombing campaign and how it was carried out. Hegseth said these attacks were the result of a breakdown in negotiations to get a new deal to place limits on Iran's nuclear program, more or less the same deal that Trump ended during his first term because it was a deal brokered by Obama and he didn't like that. Now, those talks were restarted back in March, and Hegseth said that Trump had imposed a sort of 60-day deadline that he didn't tell anyone about and had been planning this bombing raid for, quote, weeks or months. And just last week, though, Trump said that he wanted 2 more weeks to decide whether he was going to bomb Iran. And now some White House officials are telling Axios that that was a head fake to keep Iran on its toes, but that doesn't really square with the timing from what we know from our own intelligence community, our own intelligence agencies. Because as recently as just a few months ago, Trump's director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, testified to Congress that Iran was not close to developing a nuclear weapon and maintained that up until last week after Trump got angry with her for breaking with what he's being told by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been saying for decades that Iran is only just weeks away from a bomb that they have yet to build. Now, even today, our intelligence agencies are still split about whether Iran is close to a weapon or how long it would take them to build one, but they all agree that a ban on making a bomb is still in place by Iran's supreme leader, and even if it wasn't, Iran does not have a way to deliver a nuclear bomb to Israel or the U.S. right now. And maybe most importantly, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the final international authority on nuclear power, said last week that despite Iran not being open about specific technical pieces of its nuclear program, they were not making a nuclear weapon. There was no evidence of that. And I want to be really clear here, too. There isn't anybody on the planet, outside of maybe Russia and North Korea in certain circumstances that I'll talk about a little bit later, who thinks that Iran having a nuclear weapon is a good thing. Their government is categorically unhinged, unpredictable, and does not care about global destruction because they see it as a religious necessity to enter an eternal afterlife, to wipe Israel, and then later the U.S. right off the face of the earth. And I really don't think that I need to say this, but that is really, really bad. It's why there have been calls for more than 50 years to have close international monitoring and sanctions to keep Iran from building a weapon which so far have worked. But let's get back to Trump. So if he'd asked for more time just last week and the intelligence from our own agencies isn't there, why would Trump carry out this campaign that could spill out into a larger war or get the U.S. actively involved in another war in the Middle East after promising during the campaign that he wouldn't do that? Well, some new reporting from the New York Times today says, as it kind of always seems to be for Trump, about how all this looked on TV. So the Times is reporting that 4 months, Trump has been telling Netanyahu not to attack Iran. But after the first Israeli airstrikes just over a week ago, quote, Trump marveled to advisors about what he said was a brilliant Israeli military operation, and then started talking to reporters, hailing the operation as excellent and very successful, and hinting that he had much more to do with it than people realized. And then Mr. Trump asked an ally how the Israeli strikes were, quote, playing. He said that, quote, everyone was telling him he needed to get more involved. So what that says is that where these strikes really came from, this bombing campaign came from, was Trump wanting to be given more credit for what Israel was doing. And we know that he was trying to angle his way in there because last week on social media, he was posting all sorts of things like the U.S. had control of Iranian airspace, or that American munitions or planes were being used by Israel, or that he seemed to have advanced knowledge of Israeli airstrikes outside of the normal thing that a president would get from another foreign leader. But mainly, it seems like Trump carried out this bombing campaign in Iran because he liked the way the Israeli airstrikes were being covered on TV. And I said this last week too, but Trump also needs a boost in public opinion right now. His poll numbers are down to their lowest point since he came into office. His majority initiatives, like mass deportations and the tariffs, are not popular by a long shot, according to polling right now. And generally, Americans are supportive of a president who they see as strong when it comes to foreign policy, especially against a country like Iran. And we haven't had any polling about that just yet, at least not reliable polling, so I'm going to wait to talk about that in likely a later episode or on the Substack. But since the bombing, there are 3 big questions. Are we at war with Iran? Was this legal under U.S. law? And what happens next? And let's take those in order. So first, the White House official line is that we aren't at war. Here's J.D. Vance on NBC's Meet the Press yesterday.
President, is the United States now at war with Iran?
No, Kristen, we're not at war with Iran. We're at war with Iran's nuclear program. And let me just say...
So we can all agree that this is dumb, right? In politics, there's spin, there's lies, and there's stupid. And this one falls into that last category. We bombed Iran government facilities. Of course, Iran will see that as an act of war against them, or at the very least, an act of aggression. To say that we're not directly involved in a war with Iran just doesn't make sense. Second, it's unclear what America's goals are right now when it comes to actively being involved in this war. At the press briefing from the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the U.S. isn't interested in another regime change like Iraq.
This mission was not and has not been about regime change. The president authorized a precision operation to neutralize the threats to our national interests posed by the Iranian nuclear program and the collective self-defense of our troops and our ally Israel.
So that's unequivocally clear. Except just 8 hours later, Trump posted on Truth Social, quote, it's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, which he put in all caps, why wouldn't there be a regime change? He said with 3 question marks, and then wrote MIGA, M-I-G-A, which has 3 exclamation points in it. So that's the president of the United States calling for a regime change in a Middle Eastern country over accusations that country has weapons of mass destruction in which our intelligence community cannot back up. Stop me if you've heard this before. So, are we at war? Not formally, but boy, are we doing all the things that certainly look like we are. But let's move on to whether this was legal, because formally, only Congress can declare war. But the last time they did that was in 1942. Instead, since the 1970s, there's been something called the War Powers Act, which allows the president to notify Congress at least 48 hours before deploying a military operation if there's an imminent threat to the U.S., and that can only continue for 60 days with a 30-day timeline for withdrawal, so let's call it 3 months. Now, this law has been used by Democratic and Republican presidents for decades to justify everything from surprise ground operations, covert operations, airstrikes, full-scale war operations, and each time, members of Congress from the opposite party have decried these things as illegal. They've called for impeachments, but Congress doesn't do anything about it. This time around, the Pentagon says that they were in compliance with the War Powers Act, but that doesn't actually seem to be the case because senior members of Congress, known as the Gang of Eight, which are party leaders from the Senate and the House, as well as the chairs and ranking members, so the minority party leaders, in this case it would be Democratic leaders, on the intelligence committees of both the Senate and the House, say they weren't notified. Specifically, the Democrats are saying they weren't told, and Congress as a whole was not briefed on this operation, which is what the War Powers Act says needs to happen. Here's Republican Congressman from Kentucky, Thomas Massie, who has joined a Democrat from California, Representative Ro Khanna, and Democratic Senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine, in putting up a resolution that would force Congress to rework the War Powers Act. He talked this weekend on CBS about how angry he is that Congress wasn't called back into session because they're on vacation right now to talk about these strikes.
To do this. It was a limited, necessary, targeted strike, he says.
Well, he's probably referring to the War Powers Act of 1973, but that's been misinterpreted. There was no imminent threat to the United States, which was what would authorize that. And I think that's peculiar to hear that from the Speaker of the House. Look, Congress was on vacation last week when all this was happening.
You haven't been briefed on any.
We haven't been briefed. They should have called us all back. And frankly, we should have debated this War Powers resolution that Ro Khanna and I offered instead of staying on vacation and doing fundraisers and saying, oh, well, the president's got this under control. We're going to cede our constitutional authority.
Ro Khanna.
So Massie has been really outspoken and has been maybe the most outspoken Republican against a lot of what Trump has been doing across the board, but has also been alone for a lot of this. I mean, even today, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson said that he doesn't think that the War Powers Act needs to be looked at again or even really needs to be brought up in the case of this Iranian bombing. And I also know that there are a lot of people online that say that Trump couldn't tell the Democrats in this case because they would have leaked something about the bombing. One, there's no evidence of that. Frankly, given what happened earlier this year with Pete Hegseth and this group Signal chat, I would suggest that call might actually be coming from inside the House. But two, there's also a law that says the president isn't allowed to keep these kinds of things from members of Congress just because he thinks they might leak that information. In fact, the law straight up says that it can't be construed to be believed that a president can withhold intelligence because they're worried about leaks. When they wrote this law, they actually got in front of that. And I also know that there are a lot of people out there who think that talking about what's legal or illegal when it comes to Trump is, cute because it doesn't matter to him. And that might be true. It certainly seems to be his MO this time around. But that doesn't mean that we also have to believe that same thing and that we also have to stop caring about the law and the way things should be. It's not about whining about Trump breaking the rules. It's the point of caring about the reality of these things that means we need to keep the rule of law front and center. So it's important to keep talking about these things and the laws that surround them, and I'm going to keep doing that. Finally, the big question is what happens next, with a lot of people asking, are we headed for World War III? And the answer right now seems to be no, although we are quite a bit closer than we were last week. As of today, Iranian and U.S. forces are confirming that Iran has carried out airstrikes on the U.S. base in Qatar, our largest base in the Middle East. They did give advanced warning, so we evacuated, and there so far have been no reported casualties. Essentially, this is what's called a proportional response. It's a lot like what happened during Trump's first term when he'd ordered an airstrike that killed a top Iranian general. It's a tit-for-tat kind of thing, and it gives both sides an exit ramp out of conflict. Now, is that the end of it? We don't know. There are still concerns about where the Iranian nuclear material stockpile is, whether Russia will get involved somehow, though they're pretty tapped out when it comes to resources and money right now as they continue to fight in Ukraine, but they could promise to help Iran by getting Iran to agree to send missiles into Europe. That's a long shot kind of a thing, but it's still there. It could also embolden a country like China to attack Taiwan because there doesn't seem to be any consequence for military campaigns anymore. People are also closely watching the Strait of Hormuz. It's this little strip of water between the United Arab Emirates and Iran that's between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. It's responsible for 20% of all the oil shipments on Earth, and Iran, which controls it, has threatened to shut it down, which would send oil and gas prices soaring and would cause all sorts of other supply chain problems. Iran has also threatened to activate quote-unquote sleeper cells in the U.S. or in our ally countries, which seems to be a bluff. But Iran also funds Hezbollah and Hamas, which is more important here because they could be re-emboldened or more likely refueled with money or weapons to carry out more attacks on Israel or on U.S. service members and civilians and our allies around the world. Or they could come back to the negotiating table to resume talks about their nuclear program with Trump, and this thing worked out in the way the White House, I guess, sort of seems like they want it to be, at least on one hand, as a show of strength to force these talks to continue. We just don't know right now. And all of that not knowing is why presidents in the past haven't done this. No matter how tense things got between Israel and Iran or Iran and the rest of the world, the consequences of what could happen were just too big and too unknown. And so that's where we are, somewhere between a full-scale war and a mafia. Gee, that's a nice country you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to its style of diplomacy, as Congress sits by and continues to not get involved. And all the rest of us have to sit and wait. Okay, I hope that helped sort some of this out. This thing is confusing, it's complicated, and it can be really scary. And that is it for our episode today. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications on YouTube if you're watching there. Sign up for the Make It Make Substack. I've got some more great articles on the way this week. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod, MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.